What's up YouTube, and welcome back for part 11 of the STI build. Today's episode I'm going to be working on the intake manifold. A lot of new parts that need to go onto the manifold, and we might as well go over the parts since they're sitting out on the bench. We have a new turbo inlet. The reason this is being used is for the 3-inch inlet to the turbo. The one that's on the car or on the manifold now is certainly smaller, so that would need to be installed. It's a Perrin inlet. We have some Cobb 1050cc fuel injectors with the adapter harnesses, which need to go into the fuel rails. Over here we have some TGV deletes from Torque Solutions. So basically we need to unbolt the TGVs and install these. The injectors will actually sit in here. I'm ready to bring out the manifold and basically start taking it apart. There's a lot of things that need to come off, including the inlet. Fuel injector rail covers will need to be unbolted and taken out of the way. The rails will have to come off, then the TGVs after that. So there's a little bit of work to do just on the manifold alone. I think I'm going to start with this bypass hose and just see if I can get it to come off of the turbo inlet. So that's the first piece off. I think I'll go ahead and get some of the easier things off, like these fuel rail covers or shields. They can be pretty obstructive. Just decided to move the camera over here because it was just shaking on the table, so just continuing to try and get out this. So that's one shield. Now with those fuel rail covers off, I'm going to try and loosen these fuel lines a little bit. Just to give me a little bit more room to sneak this inlet out of there. So the inlet's still pretty tight in there. The electrical's really wrapped around it, kind of restricting everything. And part of the harness has already been disconnected over here, so I'm just going to let everything else go on this side. Now I can just kind of drape this off over out of the way. Now these are in there pretty tight. You can see it rests right up against the manifold. It's almost jammed in place there. And some people manage to squeak these in underneath the manifold without taking it apart. But the bigger you get, the more difficult it is to do. I'm going to go ahead and undo this electrical harness holder deal. Kind of get it up over top of the fuel lines. And now I'm going to have to let go the actual fuel lines. Next, on the same side, I'm going to let the fuel rail go. And just a little couple wiggles, and the injectors will come right out. I'm going to pop them right out of the rail, put them aside. You're going to probably get a bit of fuel coming out of them. And certainly out of the rail. And used parts like this that you want to maintain, especially when O-rings can just fall off and be lost. Even if you're going to replace the O-rings, you want to use the old one for reference. So just put them all into a baggie. Go ahead and disconnect all the electrical on the other side. And you're bound to leak fuel. Make sure you have something underneath, cardboard, rags, something, because you are going to make a mess. And I think because there's only like 2 more electrical connectors, I'm just going to take the entire harness off of it. And there's one STI engine harness out of the way. So I think because this side's pretty much apart, I'll start with this one. There's basically 2 outer bolts, 2 inner bolts, and another 2 outer bolts, and the TGV set will drop off of there. And you can see how easily that just came off. So that's one of the TGVs right there. I do have the actuator off of this one, so you can see how they open and close. It's just like a half throttle. The purpose of these is cold start. They will be closed on a cold start and basically tumble the airflow. As the airflow hits the plate, it begins to go into a tumbling effect down into the chamber, mixes with the fuel there, and then gets fired into the cylinder. As it warms up to get more performance, they go wide open and stay wide open. And here's the delete piece compared next to the actual TGV. So everything does line up exactly the same. They're a little bit smaller in physical size because they don't have the actual the little bearing and the rest for the actual shaft and everything to go through. So over on this side, the opposite side that the turbo is, we've got to loosen up these fuel rails a little bit more. So there's 1 bolt on here, on top here, and then I'll loosen the bolts for the fuel rail going to the actual TGV housing. There's 1 more bolt down on here on the side holding the fuel line. And this should give us enough movement to get the injectors out of the way. So even with the fuel lines completely loose, it's pretty tight with this fuel line coming in along the side of the TGV housing. So I think what I'm going to do is actually drop off the TGV housing now. Now with that loose, I should just be able to kind of let this all fall apart, and just kind of like that. So there's the other side out of place. I'm just realizing all the basically the things that hold the fuel lines, other than the actual rail. So the fuel rail shields, and some of the retaining for the actual fuel lines. They're not actually on the new TGVs, so even those fuel rail shields will not be going back on. Off camera, I went ahead and removed the throttle body and just gave the whole manifold a cleaning with some multi-purpose cleaner, just to kind of brighten up the red look in it. and get some of those spots that are hard to get when it's all back together. So I've noticed that a little puddle of oil has accumulated down inside the inside of the intake manifold, so I'm going to try and soak it up with a rag. And it's obviously from the blow-by, from the cracked ringland. And now I'm ready to pretty much sit on the first TGV delete. So I'll sit the gasket in place. Might get knocked out of the way, but I would sit something like that. And then just hand thread in some bolts to start. So all the TGV bolts get torqued to 6.1 foot-pounds or 73 inch-pounds. And I start from the center. They don't give you a sequence, but I usually just start with the center with stuff. Then you can always come back to the center and just double check the first bolts. So you usually get a little turn out of them. And that should be first side installed anyway. So I'm just going to go ahead and whip together the other side really quickly. Okay, so now both sides are all torqued up. We're starting to actually build an intake manifold again. Next, we're ready to actually install injectors. Usually tend to put them up in the rail and then seat the rail down while you're seating the injectors into their holes. So I'll just cut open the first one. And kind of just want to, I compared them to the stock injectors. These are some really small O-rings on the bottom side, but they seem like a nice tight fit. So I'm just going to take the very slightest little bit of grease. I mean, not even this much grease is going to be left on there, and then just to lubricate the O-ring just a tiny bit for installation, just a glaze of it so you can't even see the grease. Put it up into the fuel rail. It fits really nice. It actually coils against this spring on installation to really put a lot of pressure down on the injector to hold it down in place. So we'll get the other one ready because it doesn't really want to sit in the rail with that spring. So this may be a little tricky to do, but I'm going to try and line up both injectors, position their connectors outwards like they were originally, get a lot of downward pressure. So I've got the bolts fully threaded down by hand, and everything's still lining up pretty good. The fuel injectors will turn in their holders just very slightly, and I think I'm ready to torque in this fuel rail. And the fuel rail bolts get torqued to 14 foot-pounds or 168 inch-pounds. And after tightening those bolts, the fuel injectors really don't want to turn afterwards, so make sure that you have the connectors pointed in an outward position, especially this one away from the fuel line, so that you can get your connector back on there. So that's one side finished. The 8mm Grim Speed spacers, the intake spacers, they are going to make a little bit more room for the fuel lines to actually be pried down a little bit to give us some more room in between the fuel lines and the intake manifold. So we'll take the new turbo inlet and start test fitting it through here. Something like that. Kind of leave it in the approximate position it needs to be. You might have to play with it a little bit to get it onto the turbo. So next I want to go ahead and start putting on the wiring harness. It should place something in here like this. I'm going to take these two bolts out. And now we'll at least know which direction stuff's going. There's another one to torque into place here. And after spinning the manifold around, the main harness comes out of the front here. It's a little bit of a mess right here, but I know this all has to drape over on this side, and it would actually fasten to the rail here so that these grounds can come back up on here. So we'll just temporarily kind of put those in place to hold our position. And these are the little adapter harnesses that they supply. Could recommend putting a little bit of protection on top of those wires. I just want to check fitment first, make sure they're going to work. They seem to connect perfectly fine. I have the majority of the wiring all sorted out now. The injectors are both plugged in and the connectors are kind of tucked up out of the way. Put off some other connectors that we aren't going to be reusing off out of the way. The same on the other side. You can see on this side it's a lot cleaner. The connectors, I've pretty much tucked them right underneath the rail and zip tied everything there, so they're kind of out of view and allow you to see the injectors and the TGVs. Especially with those shields out of the way, it's going to look a lot different underneath the hood. So I didn't really realize how long this video was going to be. It's a little bit longer than I thought. We are going to just finish it up. I am going to reinstall the throttle body. But even Tyler didn't realize that I went ahead and painted the throttle body. It didn't come out the greatest, but it's a lot better and a lot nicer than what it was. So I'll take all the tape off, get it mounted in place, and we'll see what the final results look like. So the throttle body bolts are 5.9 foot-pounds or 71 inch-pounds. I'm just reinstalling the map sensor that I took off for painting. You can go ahead and plug it in as well. So there it sits for now. Basically the manifold is kind of finished. It's at the point where I could install it, but like I said, I've kind of run out of time for this episode, and I'm gonna have to continue on later. But yeah, went ahead and got the TGV deletes installed, the new injectors, and the parent turbo inlet. Went ahead and cleaned things up a little bit. Took the throttle body off, cleaned it, and painted it. See, it does take some time to strip down the manifold and get all the new parts installed, but you kind of do it as a whole sectional thing, so the manifold is kind of ready to sit back on top of the long block. The inlet does still have some play going through there, so it shouldn't be too difficult to get it lined up onto the turbo. And whatever this bypass pipe going to the intercooler is going to be like, I really don't know how that stuff's going to mount in here yet, but we're going to have to save that for next time. So if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button for me. Leave your questions and comments further down below, and I'll see you in the next one.